Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. So today I'm just going to run through a video on what you need to go through if you're looking to do an LS swap yourself. I know I did a walk around video on the car where I basically just explained everything I did to it, like modification wise. So in this video I'm just going to tell you guys the stuff you need to look at, the parts you need to gather if you're looking to LS swap your own third gen. So the first thing you want to do, obviously, you're going to want to track down an engine and a transmission. You want to decide which engine size you want to go to, which transmission you want to use. You want a manual, you want an automatic. That's going to decide on which wiring harness you're going to want to buy. If you're going to have to buy a clutch, if you're going to have to get an aftermarket converter. So once you get your engine size and your transmission choice down, then you could start ordering parts. Like I said, for my car, as you all know, I have a 5.3 iron block LM7 out of a Silverado. Now my transmission is a 6-speed T56 that came out of a 97 Camaro. Now when I originally put this car together, I actually had a 350 small block in it. It had the 2.8 V6, and then I went to a 350 small block with the T56. So what I did was I got an LT1 T56 out of a 97. Some of you may not know, but you cannot use an LS1, like a 98 to 02 LS1 6-speed T56. You cannot use it with Gen 1 small block Chevy. So you're going to need to get the LS1 version, which was the 98 to 02. So like I said, when I put this car together, I had the small block. I got the 4th gen 93 to 97 T56, which was for the LT1, so it was for the old small block. Ran it was great. And then when I decided I wanted to do the LS swap, I had to either find another transmission, because like I said, the input shaft for the LS transmission is different. I believe it's longer for the LS transmission. I think the bell housing is different. I'm not 100%. I'm pretty sure the bell housing is different though. And the end cover, the front cover on the transmission, is also different for the LS. So what I had to do was I had to buy a different input shaft, different bell housing, and the front cover. I think all those parts came out to about 600 bucks. I paid $1,000 for the transmission for the 93, the old small block LT1 T56. I paid $1,000 for that on Craigslist with like 90,000 miles. So after getting all the parts to convert it to an LS1 transmission, I was in it about maybe $1,500-$1,600, which at least this was like 4 years ago. Back then the LS transmissions were going anywhere between $1,500 to $2,000. So I did the math, it was going to be the same price anyway, so I decided it would be easier. I already had the transmission, I could just easily convert it so it'll work with an LS1. Get your engine choice down. Like I said, I went with a 5.3. You can go to 6.0, 5.7. Engine size doesn't really matter. The only thing you want to do is you want to make sure you got to decide if you're going to be running truck accessories, truck coils, like truck injectors. All that stuff makes a difference. So what I ended up doing, I got my motor on Craigslist, 300 bucks. It was a long block. The guy was putting a 6.0 in his Silverado. So he basically took the 5.3 out, he took all the accessories, sensors, everything out, and he swapped it over to his 6.0. So when I got this motor, it had nothing on it. Basically, it was a long block with heads, and that was it. No valve covers, no rockers, no sensors, no oil pan. The thing was just picked dry. It didn't even have the cover that goes over the NOx sensors. So, I mean, it was pretty stripped out. I mean, I paid 300 bucks for it. It had 89,000 miles, I believe. So it was a good price anyway, so it wasn't too bad. But then I went on Rock Auto. I tracked down all the sensors. I decided, like I said, you got to decide which sensors you're going to run for your harness. So I got all LS sensors. I just went Rock Auto 2002 Camaro, and I ordered cam sensor, crank sensor. I ordered LS1 coils, which these I have the round coils. I knew I was going LS1 injector, so I got all LS stuff. LS1 accessory drive. And like I said, all these LS motors did the same, so all those parts, just, it doesn't matter, it's a truck motor, all the LS stuff will fit. You can swap all those sensors right over. That's not a problem. So once that was finished, then I went ahead and I bought my harness, and I'll put a link in the description below for the harness I used. The company's called PSI Conversion, PSI, like his entire pressure, and it was the best harness I could find for the money. I paid $580 for the harness, and it comes completely loomed. It comes with an OBD connector. It's literally plug and play. You don't have to do anything to it. There's a ground that goes behind the head. There's 2 wires, I believe, that go to the starter, and then there's a ground under the dash that goes near the computer, and then the computer plugs right in. I bought the harness for an LS1 computer, so that's another thing. You got to make sure. I believe the trucks use like a green and blue connector. The LS cars use a red and blue connector, so you just want to match that to your harness. But go check out that website. It has all different harnesses. You could pick, if you're running an auto, you could get an auto 5.3 Vortec harness, so it'll have all the connectors for the truck sensors, or you could get like an LS harness with T56, and it won't have any of the auto connections. You know, it'll have all the LS sensor connectors. It'll have the speed sensor for the T56, or you could get the LS with the 4L80. I think you get an LS with 4L60. So, I mean, for $580, a complete harness for your exact application. It has all the emission stuff deleted, no rear O2 sensors. So for the money, it was the best harness I could find. I mean, a lot of people go with the painless harness too, but I looked at them. They run maybe between like $700 to $900 for the painless, and in my experience, they're not very painless at all. I mean, the harness comes, it has no loom on it. It's just, there's a bunch of extra wires. The whole thing's just a mess. So for the money, PSI conversion, if you're looking at doing a swap, definitely go pick up that harness. I have no affiliation with them, not a sponsor whatsoever. It's just such a great harness for the money. I can't recommend it enough. If you're doing a swap, definitely look into that harness. So once you decided what motor you're going to use, you know, the sensors you're going to run, the accessory drive you're going to run, you know, what's going to fit under the hood, you know, let's just talk about my car, for example. You know, okay, I want a 6-speed, I'm going to do a 5.3, I got an LS1 computer. You get your harness. Getting this motor in, you're going to need conversion brackets. For my 3rd gen, I'm using UMI Performance conversion brackets. They bolt in the spot of the original 3rd gen motor mount, and then it accepts a factory 4th gen LS mount. I'm just using a regular 4th gen mount, and that just lines right up with the adapter bracket. So that's extremely easy. They make a ton of aftermarket stuff as far as LF swaps goes for these now. So motor mounts aren't a problem. I think those things cost like $100 for the pair. That's all you need to do. Easiest way for a 3rd gen, in my opinion. I wouldn't even bother with like they have the adapter plates where you can slide the motor back and all that. I didn't bother with that. I just went with these, bolted them right in, no problem. Cross member. A lot of you know, if you're keeping AC with these cars, you have to notch the cross member. I don't know how well you're going to be able to see this. You probably can't see it at all. I mean, I have, when I had the motor out, I cut a notch in the cross member for the AC compressor to fit. Now, you don't have to do that. I just want to use the LS compressor, you know, keep everything, you know, looking at OEM as far as an LS standpoint. But they make like a sand-in compressor kit where it bolts right up here. You could keep your factory 3rd gen compressor. That's not a problem. You could just get the aftermarket bracket that puts the compressor up here. So you don't really need to do that. What you do, however, need to do is notch the oil pan. Not the oil pan. You got to notch the cross member for the oil pan, because I'm running an LS oil pan. I might be able to crawl in here and you can see. But I'm running an LS1 oil pan. Yeah, you can see it. And I had to notch the back of the cross member there because this pan doesn't hang very low, so it stretches out over, so it's shallow. So when you're dropping the engine in, not only to get the clearance when you're dropping the engine in, but when the motor is actually in the car, the oil pan is going to rub a little bit on that cross member, unless you have semi-solid mounts. I have like the poly mounts, so that brings the motor up a little bit, and it gives you enough clearance. But before I did that, I just had the factory rubber mounts, and like when I would go to the track and I would launch, you would hear the motor like metal to metal touching the frame, and like it would just resonate through the whole car. So to fix that, I went and I got the poly mounts that, you know, they don't squish down that much, so it keeps the motor up a little higher, so you don't have to worry about that happening. So motor mount wise, I would definitely get the poly mounts. UMI Performance adapters. AC, if you're using it, you can decide if you want to go and notch the cross member to fit the compressor like I did, or spend a little extra money. You don't have to do it, you don't have to fabricate anything, and you can move, get the compressor up here, keep your factory compressor from the 3rd gen, or relocate it and use the LS compressor. Either way, to make a kit to use either compressor, that'll mount it up there. Also, if you don't want to like have to fabricate anything and you have the cash, you could just go and get like a tubular cross member. Then you won't have any of these problems. The AC compressor will clear it, and you won't have to notch the back for the pan. So that's another way to go. If you're not running AC, then you don't have that problem. You don't have to worry about it. Oh, also for the lines, I'm using Hawk's 3rd gen AC lines, so they fit the stock 3rd gen stuff, and it just bolts right up to the factory LS compressor. The other thing is then the transmission cross member, which also not a big deal. They make lots of parts for these cars. I originally had a Spawn Performance cross member, but now I have a Hawk's 3rd gen cross member for the trans. So it has like little hoops in it so the exhaust could clear. It gives you a little more ground clearance, even though my ground clearance is pretty terrible as it is. That bolts up to the exact same spot as the 3rd gen cross member. Like everything as far as you know, drivetrain distance, you know, with the how everything sits, it's pretty much the same as the factory motor. Like once you get these mounts, the motor falls into like the perfect spot. The transmission, whether you go, I'm assuming, I can't speak for the 4L80, but I know because that didn't come in the F bodies, they got the 60, but I know for a fact the 4L60, I'm pretty sure the same thing, the cross member will fall in the exact same spot. You don't have to like drill in the other holes. But yeah, the cross member screws right into the factory 3rd gen frame holes. You just put your mount on, drop it in, that's it. You know, no modification needs to be done. And if, like I said, you go and get the tubular cross member, you don't have to notch anything. Everything just bolts right in. And so that's it really. Your motor's in, your transmission's hooked up. As far as the clutch goes, you can use regular 4th gen master and slave cylinders. I have the Tick Performance 4th gen slave cylinder. It goes in the factory 3rd gen spot. Hose comes up, goes to the slave inside the bell housing. Once again, everything bolts right in, no modifications needed. I'm not 100% sure if I had to modify the pedal. I know you could swap to 4th gen pedals inside the car, and then everything will hook up, like as far as the clutch linkage sliding onto the pedal. All that'll be, you know, no problem to line up. The connections will all be the same, like with the clip and everything. That's what I originally did, and then I went back to the 3rd gen pedals because I was having a problem where my master was leaking because of firewall flex when I was pressing the clutch, and it turns out that the 3rd gen pedals were a little beefier. They had like these rods that come down and brace the firewall, so that's why I switched back to them. And I think I just I drilled a hole and I put like a bolt through the pedal so the linkage will line up. I think that's what I did to modify to make it fit with the 4th gen clutch master, because I believe the eyelet on the end is like it's thicker than the 3rd gen one, so there wasn't room to get a clip on there. So I just popped out the stud that was on there, put a bolt through it, and a nut and some Loctite, and that's what I ended up doing. So we got motor, wiring harness, clutch, transmission. Now you're gonna need fuel. Like I said, this was originally a V6 car, so I had the wiring going back to the pump. It was a MFI car, so I kept the factory wiring in there. I just pulled the old pump out. I put in a Walbro 255, pretty straightforward, just swapped the pump. For the hoses, I went with AN braided fittings. I'm using I replaced the line, but I'm using the factory 3/8 size hard line. I just put like a new hard line in there to replace the old like 30-year-old rusted one. And then I just got these fittings off Amazon, not off Amazon, off of Summit. And I just flared the line there, and the AN fitting screws right onto the hard line there. Once you flare it, make your braided hoses and screw everything in. So that's pretty straightforward. If you're using a truck like intake and rail, the truck intake, I'm pretty sure it has the regulator, the fuel regulator built into the rail. So literally you could just run your hose off the run your fuel line off your pump, put it into your fuel filter, and then just run it up to your rail on the truck, and you're done. On this, I'm using the LS3 rail. It doesn't have a regulator in the rail, so if you use, I'm pretty sure it's early 2000s, there's a C5 Corvette fuel filter. It has the regulator built into it, and a lot of guys go that route. On the tank end of the filter, you have two fittings like that. One goes in, and then the bottom is the return. So the return goes right through the filter and goes back out to the tank, right at the back of the car. Then on the other end, you just have the one hose coming out, and that comes up to your fuel rail, and then that's it. It's already regulated at like 60 psi, what it's supposed to be at. You don't have to get an aftermarket regulator. That's the cheapest and the easiest way to get your filter, get your regulator, and not have to fumble around with like an adjustable aftermarket expensive regulator. So if you're not running a Vortec intake and fuel rail, definitely go with the C5 fuel filter regulator, because unless you're doing like you're planning on making big power right away, easiest way to get your car running is to do it that way. As far as the fuel goes with the harness, the PSI harness comes with a relay block. I would show you, but I have the whole thing like tucked under the dash. I don't want to have to take all the plastics out again. I have to tuck the wires back. But if you go and look at that harness, the PSI conversion harness comes with the whole fuse block with the relays for the pump already intact in there. All you have to do is hook your fuel pump wire into the relay, and then like supply the relay with 12 volts. There's a whole manual that comes with the harness. Like, it's really easy to do. The manual explains everything. You just gotta follow the steps. It tells you what's supposed to be a ground, you know, what wires are supposed to get constant cranking voltage, what goes to the starter. So it's really a very straightforward, easy to use harness. All right, so two more things that I want to cover. Probably the most difficult things of the whole swap. Believe it or not, yeah, the wiring isn't the difficult part. Well, some of it's wiring. That's going to be the gauges, getting all your gauges to work, and the exhaust. Now, when I swapped my car a few years ago, there wasn't many exhaust options for this motor in third gens. Really, the only thing you could do was either get the Hawks headers, which were like $900, or use the factory manifold and like make your own Y pipe. So when I first swapped this car, that's what I did. I used factory 4th gen Camaro exhaust manifolds. I bought the flanges off eBay, and I just welded them to my own pipe, and I had them come down, and then I used the Hawks, the Y pipe. I think it was like $200. That Y pipe I have under the car. I used the Hawks, like the kind of merge pipe, and I just made my own 2 pipes coming down off the manifold, and then it went into those two Hawks pipes, which you can see where the headers are going into now. That's that whole piece there, minus the little flex part. That's all from Hawks. So I just had literally one pipe come down and did a 45, and then right into that pipe there with a clamp. And that's what I did. I just ran the factory manifolds for a while, and because I didn't want to spend the $900 for the Hawks ones. And eventually, maybe a year later, they started making like Chinese knockoffs on eBay, and that's what I'm running now. I have they're basically Hawks knockoffs off of eBay. They were $300 for the pair. They're 1 3/4 inch long tubes, and I've been running them for like 3 years so far. They don't look too pretty. They're a little crusty looking, but I mean, for $300 knockoff headers, they don't leak. The fitment is really good on them, surprisingly. I mean, the only downside is the ground clearance on the passenger side. The header's pretty low. I know how to drive this car, so I don't really scrape that much, but you can see how much that hangs down past the frame. I'm not 100% sure. I don't know if the Hawks, because these are knockoffs, I don't know if the Hawks header is like that now, is also like that. But I do know that Hooker, I think it's Hooker Blackheart series, they now make a really nice stainless header, long tube header for this car, full catback like LsxMatt exhaust system, which I really want to do someday. That's definitely on my list of things to do. I know that header, I've seen it online, the header's more tucked up between the frame rail and the transmission, so it doesn't hang down like that. And I mean, they're just really nice headers, so that's something I definitely want to upgrade down the line. Now for the gauges. Now, to get the gauges to work in this car, it's really not hard. The only thing really, depending on what year your car is, like I said, this car is an 86. So as you know, the 86 used the speedometer cable, which ran off the gear on the back of the transmission, and literally it's just a cable that comes up through the firewall, and the cable spins the needle. So when I first put this car together, I was just using like the GPS on my phone for a speedometer, because they sold like a converter box. It was like $400. I didn't feel like buying it. I just used the phone. And if you have, I think they did it in, correct me if I'm wrong, I think 1990 or 91. It may have even been earlier than that. They went to the speed sensor buffer box like I have in this car. It took a digital signal instead of the cable, so they got rid of the cable. So like I said in my walk around video, that's the reason why when I had my roller car for the ground effects, I took the whole dash out, because I had this free 145 mile per hour speedo, which was the fastest speedo you could get in these cars, and it was the digital, so literally for nothing. I just had it free with the car. I wasn't even buying the car for the dash. I had a working speedometer. Definitely really good if you have the newer style dash in these cars. Tachometer is really simple. You just got to use, I think Thirdgen.org has all the wiring diagrams. That's what I used. It tells you which colors for the speedometer signal. I ran that wire to the wire that goes to the cluster for the tach, and then that could be adjusted when you have the car tuned through HP tuners. They can change the signal on the tach so it'll read accurate. So that's the miles per hour, that's the tach. The odometer obviously goes with the miles per hour. Gas gauge, nothing gets touched there. Gas gauge works just like it did before. You're using the stock sender in the car. Oil pressure, I'm using, I got an adapter, and I was using the factory, the Thirdgen oil pressure the big like kind of canister sensor. I got like a 90-degree adapter, and I had that kind of like sitting back here. So you can use the factory sender, but then I found out that I think the LS used the same signal after I put the 90s cluster in. It was like reading it read the same, so I just went to that sender, and the oil pressure gauge works fine. But like I said, you could just keep a Thirdgen piece and just go to a hardware store and just get like the little brass adapters and make it so it clears the intake, and you'll have an oil pressure gauge, no problem. Or you just go aftermarket. Either way, it's really easy to do. And then the only other thing, really, the most important, I think, I mean, voltage obviously stood the same. Nothing got touched there. That's just reading off like the harness. For the coolant, I used there's two sensors. This one on this side of the head, this goes to the computer. That's what tells the computer how hot the engine is. And then the hole in the back of the head back there is the one that I was using. That one's for my gauge. So my gauge doesn't read 100%. I know where the temperature is at. It's off by maybe like 10-15 degrees, but I know I'm driving the car long enough. I know what temperatures, you know, if it's too hot, if it's too cold, so it doesn't really matter too much. But I'm pretty sure, I think the Thirdgen sensor is really huge. It's like maybe like a half-inch fitting or something, if I remember. So it wouldn't fit in the head. So I've just been running it this way for a while. I never had a problem. But like I said, if you just use your phone, or if you get like a scan gauge or some kind of like digital, like an app or a tablet, and just mount it on the dash, which I was doing for a while, that'll tell you basically everything going through the computer OBD wise. So that'll tell you the exact temperature that the computer's reading off the engine, and it'll get you an idea of where you're at until you get your gauges hooked up. But other than that, that's the exhaust, that's the gauges. The wiring really isn't terrible. If you're going into one of these things and you have, my car, like I said, my car was fuel injected. Basically, the whole harness on the left side of the car gets ripped out. That's the whole computer harness to the old stuff. That goes through the fender and to the factory computer. So what I did, I just cut that harness clean and just put the little grommet back in the firewall to plug the hole up. And all that's gone. You don't need any of that. What you do need is the wiring on this side of the car. However, there are still a few like random sensors and stuff that you don't need. So what I did, I pulled that whole harness out. I looked at a wiring diagram online. Once again, I think I got from Thirdgen.org, and I went through each wire individually, clean them up. Any connectors that like crossed over and fed into that harness, you could get rid of. You know, cut them down, relume the thing. That's nothing. That just cleans it up. You know, gets rid of any wiring you don't need. And then really, what you're going to be left with are the wires for your oil pressure and coolant temperature. And I think the oil pressure is like a tan wire and the coolant's a green one. So that's why you want to go. You want to pull that harness out. You're keeping everything on this side. Pull the harness out of the firewall. Go look at the wiring diagram. It'll tell you what color does what, and just mark it. You know, like oil pressure, put a piece of tape on it. You know, coolant temperature gauge, and then just leave them tied up. Get everything running, and then those are the wires you're going to hook back up to make your gauges work. That's basically what this whole side of this harness is going to be for. This is going to make your gauges work. All your gauge wiring is coming out of this side. So that's what you want to use. As far as actually powering the new fuel injected harness, I made a hole directly above, when I had the motor out, directly below the AC box. There's like a space behind this head. I think it's like a 1 an inch and an eighth or something like that hole. The manual with the harness tells you how big the hole got to be. It comes with a grommet. I made the hole, put the harness through. I have the computer in the factory Thirdgen spot, like tucked into the dash. And as far as wiring up, like with, like I said, like the instructions tell you the wiring you're gonna need, like what gets constant 12 volts, what gets cranking, all the, you know, cranking 12 volts, what's a ground, what goes to the pump. All that stuff is explained and labeled in the instructions for the harness. But as far as getting those wires for what you're going to use, the best part is all your wires from your factory computer that you're not using anymore are just there. You have the 2 connectors. So I just went in with a power probe and probed each wire, you know, cranking voltage. Okay, this one has cranking voltage. And that's how I got all the wires I was going to use to power my new computer. So it's really simple. You have all the wiring there. You could just cut the white connectors off and heat shrink, solder in your new connectors, and you're really done. You don't have to like go into the strip, you know, take the dash apart, over to the ignition, you know, looking for wires. Everything's there from the factory computer. Same thing if you had a carburetor car. The carburetors had, I think they also had a computer too. So you'll have for like all this, yeah, the quadrajets, like with all the sensors and shit that are on those things, they ran a computer too. So the same thing. You'll have, you're not going to have like a fuel pump in the back and all that. You're going to have to run your own wires back to the fuel pump. So it's going to be easier if you had a fuel injector car to begin with, but still you're going to have wires there that you're not going to be using anymore that you could just tap into and make your new connections for your LS1 PCM. Yeah, also, you're going to want to, if you do pick a wire you're going to use, say you got like a purple wire, it has constant cranking voltage, you want to try to look online and see if that wire does anything else in the car, because for instance, I had a problem when I put my car together. When I would come to a stop, the fans would turn off, only when my foot was on the brake. And what happened was I ended up tapping into the wire for the torque converter lockup. So my fans would be working, and then I think when you hit the brake, the converter's supposed to unlock, like if you're on the highway. So yeah, when I would hit the brake, the voltage would cut away from the wire, it would turn off, and then my fans would turn off. It took me a little time. I drove like that a while, like with my handbrake. I was too lazy to figure out what it was, and then eventually I went under the brake switch. I knew it had to be something like that, and then I realized it was the torque converter lockup. So just try to figure out which wires are gonna connect it to any other switches in the car before you hook anything up, because you might run into problems like that. All right, so I think the last thing I want to go over would be the fans. Once again, back to the PSI conversion harness. It has a wire that grounds the fan relay. As if you saw my pusher fan video, there's a green wire that, like there's a separate section of the harness that just runs to the engine bay, and I had that coming out over here, and that has different wires for like fan relays and stuff like that, for like AC fans. And for the factory fans from the LS cars were controlled by the PCM, so the PCM would ground that green wire, and then that would ground your relay and turn your fans on. So the PSI conversion uses the same thing. I think most harnesses do the same thing anyway, but it has that wire here. So I'm using the LS1 fans, as you know, and the wiring's here. You just got to wire it up yourself. You know, you got to get your own fan relays, or eBay you could get they sell like LS, like a whole relay block with the relays already in it, and then you just got to like hook it up to power, hook up your PCM green wire, and then you're good to go and run the wires to the fans. One more thing I just want to touch on, because there's so much stuff to like go through. I'm looking at stuff and I'm like, okay, I got to add this on. I got to tell you about this. Power steering for the car, I'm using obviously an LS pump, but I'm using the factory Thirdgen hose, and literally all I did, like the fitting's the same going into the pump as the Thirdgen pump, so I just put it in a vise. Like I had the pulley off, I put it in a vise and just literally bent it at an angle where it would screw in and it would clear the pulley. So that's all I did. But you can go and like get a hard line and flare it yourself and do some bends and just reuse the Thirdgen fittings. I'm pretty sure this is a 3/8 line, I'm pretty sure. So you can just reuse your fittings and bend your own line. It's really no big deal. And then the return, this is coming off the factory Thirdgen cooler. I just got a power steering hose here and just clamped it on. That's the return. You could just use regular clamps on that. So yeah, I think I touched on everything I wanted to here. I don't think I'm forgetting anything. But if you have any questions at all, leave them in the comments. I'll respond to you. I'll try to answer them as best as I can. If you're working on the Thirdgen, obviously I could probably answer whatever you're asking. I did have a G-body Monte Carlo before that I did the swap into, so I know a little about that as well. I didn't have that car very long, but I did swap it, so I can help you out with some of that stuff. So if you enjoyed this video, as always, be sure to like, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next time.